Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Ceramic Storytime with Sue. So I will just give a few seconds for you to come on here, maybe talk about the weather. The seasons are definitely changing. It's a lovely fall morning, Saturday morning here in Souk, British Columbia. The leaves are falling from the trees. We've had a lot of smoke from all the forest fires that are around us down in the States, some in BC. It's been pretty crazy with the smoke, so it's kind of starting to clear up a little bit. But now we have the cloudy weather of fall. So if you're here live, if you could just let me know that you can see and hear me, and I will see if I can figure that out on my own. And then we will get started. We're going to talk about kiln wash today. So how to make a good kiln wash to protect your kiln shelves. So I'm just trying to refresh my Facebook to make sure that I am in fact live. So far it's not showing me anything. So if you're here, please just type a comment in the comment section and just let me know that you're here with me. You can see and hear me, and then I will know that I'm good to go. So far, it doesn't look like I'm live. So let's see, what can I change here? Just give me 1 second. Oh, it looks like there's 3 people watching. So if you're here, thank you for joining me. Please just type say hello in the comment section. And then I will know that you can see me and hear me. And then I will get started talking about, oh, there I am. Okay, awesome. It's working. All right, so today we're going to talk about how to make a good kiln wash to protect your kiln shelves. And so if you would like to follow along, you can go to this link that's scrolling across the bottom of your screen, bit.ly, that's bit.ly/kiln wash, all one word. And then that will take you to my blog post. Let me just bring that up on my screen. All right, Dolores. Hi, Dolores. So good to see you. Dolores is in Madrid, Spain, and she can hear me loud and clear. So that's awesome. Thank you, Dolores, for chiming in there. That helps for me to know that I'm not just talking into the void. So I'm going to bring up my blog post on the screen here. Okay, just give me 1 sec, and I will share my screen. There we go. I'll hide this. Okay. So, how to make a good kiln wash to protect your kiln shelves. So if you go to this blog post on my website, then you can also download it as a PDF. So if it's something that you want to save to your files, there's a link at the top of the page that you can click, and you can just enter your email address, and then it will send you this whole blog post as a PDF. So you can keep that for your files. So first off, let's talk about different kinds of kiln shelves. And as I'm reading through this blog post, feel free to type your questions and comments into the comment section, and then I will answer them as I go. So before I talk about kiln wash, pardon me, just take a sip of water. Okay, let's start again. Had a frog in my throat. All right, different kinds of kiln shelves. Before I talk about kiln wash, I want to talk about kiln shelves. The kiln shelves that I'll be referring to in this article are high alumina kiln shelves. Alumina is a highly refractory, meaning that it melts at a super high temperature, cone 42 to be precise, which makes a good material for making kiln shelves. So cone 42, if you can think, we fire our pots to cone 6 or cone 10, we're bisque firing to cone 06 or 04. So cone 42 is way up there in temperature. I think it's around 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that. So high alumina kiln shelves are the beige colored shelves that are sold with most electric kilns nowadays. They are the cheapest kiln shelves you can buy, and they work well, but are prone to warping after many high temperature firings. There are other kiln shelves out there that are lighter, don't warp, and are more expensive and don't require kiln wash. Nitride bonded silicon carbide shelves, for example, don't require kiln wash because glaze won't stick to them, like magic. If you have this kind of kiln shelf, you don't necessarily need to worry about kiln wash. So we have the nitride bonded silicon carbide shelves in our gas kiln, and that is helpful because they don't warp. They're quite thin and sturdy, and they will last and are very versatile and can take the heat of and the flames and the impact of a gas firing. But if you have high alumina kiln shelves like I do, using kiln wash is highly recommended. So here is a kiln shelf without kiln wash on it. So this is a brand new kiln shelf before it gets any kiln wash painted on it. Kiln wash saves our kiln shelves. Kiln wash is a material that you can paint onto your kiln shelves. It looks very similar to a glaze when being applied. It acts as a barrier to prevent unexpected glaze runs or drips from ruining your shelves. Kiln shelves are made of a hard material that is similar to fired clay. If you don't use kiln wash, any glaze that comes into contact with your kiln shelf gets absorbed and becomes permanently fused to the kiln shelf. So here's a photograph of glaze drips on unprotected shelves. And you can see, like in this picture, the glaze is like absorbed right into the kiln shelf. So even if you're trying to grind that off with an angle grinder, you're going to have to like gouge out the kiln shelf to get that glaze out of there. The only way to get the glaze off a bare shelf is to grind down the part of the shelf that the glaze has stuck to. This is a process that takes time, elbow grease, and usually leaves your shelves gouged, bumpy, and uneven. We don't want bumpy, uneven shelves because this can cause our pots to warp during the glaze firing. We want our shelves to be nice and flat. And especially if you're working with slabs or very thin pots that are susceptible to warping, if your kiln shelf is uneven, then your pots can become uneven after the glaze firing. When we do use kiln wash and our glaze runs, the kiln wash prevents the glaze from coming into contact with the shelf. Our pots may be ruined, but we've saved our shelves. This is a win because kiln shelves aren't cheap. The reason kiln wash is so effective is because it's very high in alumina, like our shelves. Remember, alumina is a refractory material that won't melt at our firing temperatures. So the kiln wash won't fuse to the kiln shelves. It won't melt and stick to the kiln shelves. Since kiln wash can't fuse to the shelf like a glaze can, the layer of kiln wash can be removed from the shelf. Think of it like a drop cloth when painting a room. Any paint drips are absorbed by the drop cloth, and then the drop cloth can be removed, leaving a drip-free floor underneath. The drop cloth protects the floor, and the kiln wash protects the shelves. So a glaze that runs or spits or was not wiped from the bottom will stick to the kiln wash and not the kiln shelf. Then the kiln wash can be removed from the shelf, saving the shelf from potential permanent scarring. Kiln wash also saves our pots. Kiln wash can also save our runny glazed pots from cracking when we remove them from the shelf. If a piece is fused to a bare shelf with glaze, something will have to break in order to remove it. Usually the pot is sacrificed, saving the shelf. But since the kiln wash allows the pot and glaze drips to be released intact if the drip is small enough, it may be possible to grind the drip off the bottom of the pot and still have a fully functioning piece of pottery. Porcelain plucking. The other thing kiln wash prevents is our clay sticking to our kiln shelves. Some porcelains, due to their high silica content, become so fluxed or melted during the firing that they have the potential to stick to an unprotected kiln shelf. This can lead to plucking, where small bits or splinters of clay stay fused to the shelf, breaking free from the piece itself. It's a disappointing way to ruin a piece of pottery. A good kiln wash should prevent plucking, although a potter recently informed me that she is experiencing porcelain plucking with her commercial kiln wash. Since we don't know what a commercial kiln wash is made of, I can't say exactly why this is happening. It's possible that the kiln wash is high in silica like porcelain, and they're both fluxing and fusing together. What I do know is that we solved our plucking issue with the kiln wash recipe that I shared down below. We were experiencing plucking with porcelain at the studio where I work. We use small discs of clay, little flat discs that we call cookies. So any glaze drips will land on the cookie, which we can throw away. This prevents a lot of kiln shelf maintenance. The cookies were originally made of bare clay with no kiln wash. Once I noticed the plucking, I decided to apply kiln wash to the cookies as well as the kiln shelves. Since we started kiln washing the cookies, we haven't experienced any more plucking. To read more about plucking and to see some photos, Digital Fire has more info, and there is a link here if you're listening to this in the future. If you go to digitalfire.com and search their site for plucking, then you can find that article. So, how to make a good kiln wash. You can often buy kiln wash in powder form from your ceramic supplier. You just add water and it's good to go. You can also make your own kiln wash from ingredients that you likely have in your glaze lab. It's cheaper to make your own, and you can also tailor the kiln wash recipe to suit your needs. A good kiln wash is not too flaky or powdery, but comes free of the kiln shelf with little effort. It requires minimal maintenance when your glazes are behaving. I found that the commercial kiln wash that I tried was way too flaky. I don't know what kind it was. I inherited it with a bunch of other glaze materials from a potter that was getting rid of their pottery studio. A flaky kiln wash is messy. It has to be reapplied often and has the potential to land on your glaze during the firing. Cracking and flaking is caused by the kiln wash materials shrinking. This can be prevented by designing your kiln wash for minimal shrinkage, which I have done in the recipe that I'm going to share below. The other thing you don't want is a kiln wash that is too hard to remove from your kiln shelves. This can happen if your kiln wash contains flux, or if you're firing in a flux-filled atmosphere like wood, salt, and soda firings. The best kiln wash stays stuck until you try to remove it, and then it scrapes off easily. So, what is kiln wash made of? Just have a sip of coffee. All right, most kiln wash recipes out there contain some combination of 3 ingredients: alumina, EPK, and or silica. Some use just 1 or 2 of the 3, and some use various combinations of all 3. Some recipes contain other materials, but these are the 3 that I have used. So let's look at these 3 ingredients and what properties they each bring to the kiln wash. Alumina is highly refractory. It's a little bit on the expensive side. So at the time that I wrote this article, alumina was $7.34 per kilogram Canadian. So alumina is highly refractory, expensive, powdery. It doesn't melt and it doesn't shrink. EPK is also highly refractory. It's cheap. It's $2.23 per kilogram. It bonds other particles together. So it helps the other particles stick to each other. It doesn't melt, but it has high shrinkage. And then silica is highly refractory, very cheap. So it's cheaper than EPK, $1.96 per kilogram. It can melt if it comes into contact with fluxes, and it doesn't shrink. So those are our 3 materials and just the properties that each brings to the kiln wash recipe. So here is my kiln wash recipe. I've created a kiln wash recipe that takes all of these properties into account and uses each of them to their greatest advantage. I measure each material by volume or by the scoop. I don't bother weighing since it doesn't need to be exact. So here's my kiln wash recipe. I use 2 scoops of alumina hydrate, 1 scoop of EPK, 1 scoop of calcined EPK, and 1 scoop of silica. So that's the main recipe. So I just measure a scoop, and it's just a little bit faster that way. And it does not need to be exact. And then I also flocculate. So once it's all mixed with water, I will flocculate it with an Epsom salt solution. So there is a link to my kiln wash recipe on glazy.org. So if you're listening to this, you can go to glazy.org and then it's recipe number 49756, or you can just search kiln wash and it should be Sue's Kiln Wash. So you're welcome to use that kiln wash recipe. So now I'm going to walk you through how I came up with my kiln wash recipe by describing each material in more detail. So this will just give you, sometimes you look at a recipe and you don't really know why all the ingredients are there. So I'm going to explain why I chose this recipe according to what each of the materials brings to the kiln wash. So starting with alumina. We could make kiln wash out of pure alumina. We can sprinkle alumina hydrate onto our kiln shelves, or we can mix it with water and paint it on. Alumina is all that's required as a barrier between our runny glazes and our kiln shelves. Using pure alumina means you have a powder that does not bond with the kiln shelf. It remains a powder during the firing and can be poured back into a container and reused. The benefit of using pure alumina is that your kiln shelves remain bare and kiln wash free, so they can be flipped over firing to firing, preventing warpage. Using alumina powder also gives your pots the freedom to move during the firing without friction. All pottery shrinks during the glaze firing, and if there's too much friction between the pot and the kiln shelf while the pot is shrinking, the pot can crack. So you might see this with large, wide slabs or plates. Sometimes they come out of the glaze firing cracked, and especially if they're quite thin. As it's shrinking, that friction of the pot moving across the kiln shelf can cause it to crack. Using a powder that can move eliminates the friction, kind of like ball bearings. This is especially helpful when firing extra wide pieces that have a large point of contact with the kiln shelf. The issue with pure alumina is that you have to be careful that none of the alumina powder falls onto any of your glazed pieces. If so, it will become a permanently embedded blemish in your fired glaze. The fact that I work at a busy pottery studio where kilns are being loaded and unloaded daily by several different people means using a loose powder in our kilns could be messy and disastrous. It's important that our kiln wash sticks to the shelves and stays there. So this is where the EPK comes in. So EPK is kaolin. It's a brand of kaolin. It stands for Edgar Plastic Kaolin. So any type of kaolin would work for this. So I have my alumina, and now I'm going to add in some EPK. By adding EPK to the alumina, we still have a highly refractory kiln wash, but the kaolin helps to bond the alumina particles to each other and to the kiln shelf. Note that bonding is not the same as melting and fusing. The EPK helps the particles stick together like clay sticks together, but they don't stick permanently to the kiln shelf as a glaze would. The EPK also helps to keep the kiln wash in suspension so it mixes well and doesn't hard pan in the bucket. I often see kiln wash recipes that are 50% alumina and 50% EPK, but there's a problem with this recipe. One drawback of using kaolin is that it shrinks. Kaolin is clay, and we all know that clay shrinks when it dries and when it's fired. This is true for kaolin in a glaze recipe and kaolin in a kiln wash recipe. Too much kaolin causes the kiln wash to shrink too much, crack, and flake off. If kiln wash flakes off during the firing, it can land in your pots and cause blemishes in your glazes. So especially if your kiln is vented and there's air circulation in there, this picture shows a cracking kiln wash. So all of these little bits have loosened from the kiln shelf and could easily be blown away, knocked free. So you can see like there's little missing spots where the kiln wash has fallen off. A glaze recipe with over 25% EPK can have problems with shrinking, cracking, and crawling. Same with kiln wash. So this 50-50 alumina EPK recipe has way too much EPK, causing way too much shrinkage. The solution to this is to substitute some of the EPK with calcined EPK. I do this with glazes and I do it with kiln wash. So the next step is we substitute half the EPK with calcined EPK. So calcined EPK, I talked about calcined kaolin, was it last week? It was either last week or the week before. So calcined EPK is EPK that has been fired high enough to remove the chemically bound water molecules, essentially pre-shrinking it. I wrote a whole article on how and why to calcine EPK. So if you go to my, actually the link would be, oh no, I can't remember. If you go to SueMcLeodCeramics.com and you can search my site on there and just search for calcined EPK and you can find that article there. So I substitute half the EPK with calcined EPK. This greatly reduces the shrinkage, but provides enough clay for the kiln wash to bond with itself and the kiln shelves. So now I have a 4-part recipe. We've got 50% alumina, 25% EPK, and 25% calcined EPK. This could also be written as 2 parts alumina, 1 part EPK, and 1 part calcined EPK. Because I don't weigh the materials, I just go by the scoop. So then the next step that I did for this recipe was add some silica as a cheap, non-shrinking filler. So the recipe I had at this point should be just fine, but I took it one step further. I had seen kiln wash recipes that called for silica, so I tried adding 1 part silica. By adding 1 part silica, I now had a 5-part recipe. So we've got 40% alumina, 20% EPK, 20% calcined EPK, and 20% silica. Or this can be written as 2 parts alumina, 1 part EPK, 1 part calcined EPK, and 1 part silica. Adding 1 part silica only reduced each of the other materials by a very small amount. And since silica is very inexpensive, I just see it as a cheap, non-shrinking filler. So it reduced my EPK from 25% down to 20%, which would reduce the overall shrinkage of the kiln wash. I also read that silica may act as a hardener, causing the kiln wash to hold up to more wear and tear before crumbling and needing to be replaced. I can't confirm or deny this claim, but I do know that our kiln wash lasts many, many firings before we have to scrape it off and start fresh. I've been using this kiln wash recipe for 5 years in a high volume studio that fires 5 to 6 kiln loads per week, and it has been amazing. Eventually, it does start to crack and need replacing, but we can go several months before any maintenance is required if there are no glaze disasters. So here is a photograph of a kiln shelf that has been fired over and over, and the kiln wash is still nice and smooth and intact and stuck to the kiln shelf. A warning about silica in kiln wash. Since silica is a glass former, it has the potential to melt into glass if it comes into contact with fluxes. Atmospheric firings that introduce salt or soda require a silica-free kiln wash. If sodium, which is a flux in the atmosphere, comes into contact with the silica in the kiln wash, it can melt and turn into a glassy layer on your kiln shelves. This would be very problematic and would defeat the whole purpose of the kiln wash. I use my kiln wash recipe in electric and gas firings, and it works great. If you're firing in other atmospheres, I would recommend leaving the silica out and going with the 4-part recipe, which is 50% alumina, 25% EPK, and 25% calcined EPK, or 2 parts alumina, 1 part EPK, and 1 part calcined EPK. All right, and then the next ingredients are water and Epsom salt solution. So all of the above ingredients need to be mixed with water and a high-speed mixer like a hand blender, hand blender or immersion blender, or a drill with a paint mixing attachment. If it's lumpy or I don't have access to a high-speed mixer, I will also sieve my kiln wash so it's smooth. I add enough water so that it's the consistency of milk, quite thin, and then I flocculate with saturated Epsom salt solution. The Epsom salt solution thickens the kiln wash, improves suspension, prevents hard panning, and improves the brushability by causing it to stay wet for longer. There's nothing worse than touching your kiln wash brush to the kiln shelf and then it dries instantly. A flocculated glaze or kiln wash stays wet longer, allowing you to brush on an even coat before it dries. So how to apply kiln wash. Kiln wash can be applied by paintbrush, roller, or by spraying. I've only tried the brushing method. A friend of mine uses a roller and swears it's life-changing, but I have yet to go out and buy a roller and try it. Make sure your kiln wash is well mixed before applying. You want it to be homogenized. I stir with my brush each time I dip back into the kiln wash. When brushing kiln wash, I always use a large wet sponge to dampen the kiln shelf first. Pre-wetting the kiln shelf prevents the water from the kiln wash from being absorbed into the shelf too quickly. We want the kiln wash to stay wet until we have an even coat. I use a wide, soft bristled brush that will hold as much kiln wash at a time as possible. Dip the brush into the kiln wash and, without rubbing the bristles on the edge of the bucket to remove excess, start painting the shelf. As soon as the brush is dry, go back for more. Apply the kiln wash very liberally with long strokes. The key is to get a nice even coat. Using many small brush strokes can make for an uneven layer. Once the shelf is covered, I allow it to dry to the touch and then add another layer. When finished, wipe any drips off the edges of your kiln shelves. So this is very important to wipe the edges and the bottom if you get any kiln wash on the bottom. If you leave them, they could flake off and land in your glazed pots during the firing. Make sure you don't get any kiln wash on the bottoms of your shelves either. Tops only, just like our pots. Always make sure your kiln wash is completely dry before firing. It will change from a darker color to light when it's dry. If the kiln wash is still damp and you put it in the kiln, you have more chance of it flaking and not adhering properly to the shelf. They may take a couple of days to dry. To speed up drying, you can use a fan or put it near a hot kiln. If possible, put your freshly kiln washed shelves through a bisque firing before a glazed firing. Bisque firings are generally slower, so any leftover moisture has time to escape. This isn't always possible, but if I have the option, that's what I do. After the first firing, check your shelves. If you can see the shelf through the kiln wash, add another layer. You want the kiln wash to be thick enough to prevent the glaze from seeping through. All right, now kiln shelf maintenance, everyone's favorite task. Oops. There's a lot I could say about kiln shelf maintenance. In the future, I'll write another detailed article all about it, but I will leave you with one kiln shelf maintenance tip. Over time, your kiln wash will start to flake and chip off. You may have craters of unkiln washed areas, like you can see here in this photograph, especially if your glazes have been running. So if you have a pot with a glaze that runs and then you pull the glaze or pull the pot off the shelf, then it's going to take the kiln wash with it. And then you may have some bare areas where there's no kiln wash on your kiln shelves. The tendency is to fill in those holes with more kiln wash. In my experience, this leads to a very messy, bumpy surface that will crack again and can lead to warped pots. We want flat, smooth kiln shelves. I'm big on keeping up with kiln shelf maintenance and not letting them get out of hand. When a shelf needs attention, I don't just fill in the craters. Here's what I do instead. I first take a grinding block and, wearing a respirator, I gently grind off the top layer of kiln wash. So I just go very gently and just remove all the bits. I just take off the layer that wants to come off. So I don't fight with it or try to get right down to the bare shelf. I make large sweeps with the grinding block to get the surface as smooth and even as possible. So I go back and forth with my grinding block, just making big sweeping motions across the top of the shelf, just to make it as even as possible. So this is my kiln shelf grinding block that I got from greenbarn.com in Vancouver. There may still be kiln wash left on the shelf. The idea is to remove the high points so the remaining layer is somewhat level. So it's okay if there's still kiln wash on the shelf as long as it's not super bumpy. Then I apply 2 layers of kiln wash to the entire shelf following the instructions above. By applying the kiln wash to the whole shelf, you have a fresh, smooth, even layer. If a kiln shelf gets really bad, I'll use more aggressive grinding methods, like an angle grinder. But for touch-ups, this is the method I use. It's fast, effective, and long-lasting. And now a tip about storing kiln shelves. So the last thing I'll say about kiln wash is this. Make sure you store your kiln shelves in such a way that the bottoms of your kiln shelves aren't in contact with the kiln washed side of another shelf. Store them so that the kiln washed sides face each other and then the non-kiln washed sides also face each other. So you've got kiln wash to kiln wash, and then you've got bottom to bottom. You don't want bits of kiln wash from the top of one shelf to get stuck to the bottom of another kiln shelf and then fall into your glazed pots during the firing. Pardon me. So I store my kiln shelves in an alternating pattern, bottoms touching bottoms and tops touching tops. So there we go. That is all I have to say about kiln wash for now. So if you have any questions, please type them into the comments section and I am happy to answer them. There's also a comment section on my blog post here. So if you are in the future, you can always respond right on the blog post in the comment section. And again, you can download, if you want to keep this whole blog post with all the pictures and everything for your files, there is a link to download it. If you go to bit.ly, bit.ly/Kiln Wash, and that'll take you right to this article. Erin says, thanks, Sue. You're welcome. So with that, I will let you go. Thank you for joining me for, a question. Hi, Lindsay. Lindsay says, if I'm using other kiln wash, should I remove all of that first, or can I just clean off the loose wash and add this over? Yeah, I would just clean off the loose wash and add this over. Yeah, and I would just do, those wide sweeping motions and just like get off the kiln wash, whatever kind of wants to come off that's already loose. And then you can just apply this over top. And that should be totally fine. I would say if your kiln wash is super thick, so if you've been applying kiln wash layer after layer without grinding it down in between, then you might want to start fresh and get down to the bare shelf or get close, just because those layers, there could be some shrinkage discrepancy between the new kiln wash recipe and what's underneath, or even some adhesion issues where it's where the new kiln wash doesn't want to stick to the old kiln wash. But yeah, if you just have a thin layer of other kiln wash, then you can just apply this over top. Bronwyn says, thank you. You're welcome, Bronwyn. And all right. So that is it for the questions. I'm in my office and I shut the door and it always gets really hot in here. By the end of my story time, I'm like, whew. Okay. So if you have any more questions, I am here for another minute or so. Otherwise, please keep in touch. You can post in the Facebook group if you have more questions or anything that you want to say about kiln wash. And just tag me if you want my feedback on anything that you post in the Facebook group. Just tag me and then I will get back to you. So I hope you all have a great weekend and I will see you on Facebook. All right. Bye.